Award-winning TV presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
Peace be upon you and welcome to the News in Brief. The Israeli occupation forces inflicted massive damages to Beit Hanun's infrastructure and the areas surrounding it, north of the Gaza Strip. From Gaza, our correspondent Hazem Badaru.
Yes, today the Israeli occupation forces withdrew from the town of Beit Hanun, north of the Gaza Strip. After 5 days of wide-scale military operations, raiding the town, destroying a number of homes, bulldozing hundreds of dunams of agricultural land, and destroying the town's infrastructure. In the past 5 days, 8 people fell martyr, and tens of others were wounded.
The Israeli government tightens its security measures, especially after the recent martyrdom attacks. Meanwhile, their forces are put on high alert. Now to our correspondent in occupied Jerusalem, Layla Ouda.
The threats of new Palestinian martyrdom attacks are of grave concern to Israel, who in turn declared a high security alert, imposing a full security and military belt around the West Bank and Gaza.
Washington presents the Security Council with a revised resolution to lift the UN sanctions off Iraq. They are hoping that the Council will vote on the resolution on Wednesday. Russia asks the United Nations to include articles on the peacekeeping missions in any resolution on Iraq. They are also asking them to adopt a resolution lifting the sanctions off Iraq. A cautious calm at the Ain al-Hilwa refugee camp in southern Lebanon, following clashes between the Fatah movement and the Al-Nur al-Islamiyya group, killing 8 people and wounding 25 others.
There is a ceasefire at the Ain al-Hilwa refugee camp. However, there are fears that fighting may erupt at any moment in light of the current situation and the presence of armed men on the narrow streets of this camp.
This is the end of the News in Brief. The White House spokesman said that U.S. President George Bush spoke with the Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen on the phone, reiterating the need to combat what he described as terrorism. Meanwhile, Israel's Foreign Minister Silvan Shalom made the same demands.
Abu Mazen must take immediate measures against terrorism. He must confiscate illegal weapons and bring the terrorists to justice. I believe that Abu Mazen is facing a new reality. Not only will he be judged by the Israelis, Americans, and Europeans, but also by the Palestinians themselves. If he is willing to combat terrorism and to stop the violence, then he will move forward with the internal reforms to the Palestinian Authority. Otherwise, he will be the same as Arafat.
Since the beginning of his term, the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon chose collective punishment as a method to end the Palestinian resistance. However, his methods did not produce the results he was expecting, and the recent operations prove it.
The Palestinian resistance carried out 5 martyrdom operations within 48 hours. The time frame and number of operations prove that Israel's violent policies in dealing with the Intifada have not produced any results. Ariel Sharon ignited the fire of the Second Intifada when he visited the Al-Aqsa Mosque on September 28, 2000. Prior to his visit, the Palestinian territories were calm. The martyrdom operations and collective punishment operations only came after Sharon's visit. It was clear from the beginning that Sharon's visit was well planned. His goal was to create an environment to implement the most violent policies against the Palestinians. In fact, Sharon began an organized campaign to eliminate members of the Palestinian resistance movements, using all possible means, such as warplanes, incursions into areas belonging to the Palestinian Authority, accompanied by massacres of Palestinian civilians and destroying their homes, resulting in the following losses. More than 2,100 Palestinians have been martyred, most of them civilians. More than 20,000 civilians have been wounded. More than 700 Palestinian homes have been demolished, and the residents are now homeless. And the Palestinian economy has deteriorated because of the Israeli closure policies, noting that the collective punishment policy is being implemented by Israel as if it were standard operating procedure. The Israeli army demolishes the homes of the families of the suicide bombers, not caring if neighboring homes are demolished in the process. The closure policies have turned the Palestinian territories into isolated islands, preventing thousands of Palestinians from getting to work. However, Ariel Sharon's goals have not been fulfilled. The martyrdom attacks have not stopped. The losses to Israel follow. 746 Israelis have been killed during various Palestinian martyrdom operations. Israel's economy has been suffering, and reports indicate that Israelis are suffering various psychological problems. Sharon tried to take advantage of the events of September 11th, labeling Palestinians as terrorists and practicing state terrorism, ignoring the fact that what is happening in Palestine is different from anywhere else in the world. Palestine is under occupation, and whenever there is occupation, there is resistance.
A number of Israeli ministers hold Yasser Arafat responsible for the latest suicide operations and accuse him of using the policy of bloodshed and terrorism. However, the Palestinian president refutes the Israeli accusations and says that they are only propaganda. In an interview with Fox News, Arafat said that he is committed to the roadmap for peace. Meanwhile, Israeli officials say that they will continue the negotiations with the Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas, but they will not host any foreign officials if they meet with President Arafat.
The Prime Minister of the occupation forces, like his predecessors, was confused and helpless in the face of the latest suicide bombing that devastated Israeli cities. Sharon claims that he cancelled his visit to Washington because of the latest suicide operation, which took place in the French Hill, killing 6 Israelis and injuring 20 others. However, in the meeting with his cabinet ministers, many other issues were discussed, such as political disillusion, lack of security, and economic deterioration, all of which were caused by the Al-Aqsa Intifada. A simple accident where a gas tank exploded in a restaurant in Tel Aviv was enough to shake the Zionist sense of security. 1 week ago, the Hamas organization was worried that the new Palestinian Prime Minister Mahmoud Abbas would try to dismantle them. But now, after it has managed to launch a wave of daring operations, the situation was turned upside down. Mahmoud Abbas himself is now afraid that Hamas will strip him from his legitimacy and ability to govern. Since the appointment of Abbas as the new Prime Minister on the 20th of April, more than 46 operations have been carried out. 3/4 of these operations were launched by Hamas. While the first meeting between Abbas and Ariel Sharon was going on, Hamas carried out a suicide operation in a Jewish settlement in Hebron, killing a couple of extremists. The settlers tried to kidnap the body of the suicide bomber to burn it. They were beating and kicking the corpse, and they also organized a protest against Sharon. This created fear and hesitation in the hearts of Sharon and Mahmoud Abbas. Before the end of the meeting, Hamas already managed to create another bloody morning with 2 suicide operations. Moreover, the Palestinian Liberation Front carried out another suicide operation in Sha'arei HaTikva, which prompted Sharon to renew the curfew on the Palestinians in Ramallah, close the checkpoints, and intensify the presence of Israeli soldiers in Arab cities. In the meeting of Israeli cabinet ministers, which was headed by Ariel Sharon, a decision was made to not expel Arafat. Political experts say that Sharon can never get rid of Arafat because he is the biggest reason that draws many Israeli votes for Sharon. In the meeting, the Israeli cabinet ministers also decided to attack Hamas and strengthen the curfew imposed against Palestinian cities, in addition to expelling the families of the suicide bombers to Gaza. Still, the Israeli government declared that the Israeli cities and other Israeli targets in the world are threatened by the possibility of suicide operations. If the suicide operations keep happening at this rate, both Sharon and Bush will go crazy. Nasser al-Laham, NBN, occupied Jerusalem.
What was billed as a concession to UN Security Council members opposed to giving the US and Britain too much control over Iraq's future, a final draft resolution by London and Washington late Monday sought endorsement of their occupation until an internationally recognized representative government is established by the people of Iraq and assumes its responsibilities. Russian Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov said that a deal on the draft resolution could be reached this week, and the clearest sign yet that Moscow could support the measure. The US ambassador to the United Nations, John Negroponte, meanwhile said that there is no role for UN weapons inspectors in Iraq.
The United States and Britain on Monday put a revised draft resolution to the UN Security Council containing some concessions to countries that want the United Nations to have more of a say in forming an interim government in Iraq. In one of the changes from two previous drafts, the text said the occupation by US and British forces would last until an internationally recognized representative government is established and assumes responsibilities. Council diplomats said the final draft would make clear that a new UN special representative with an independent authority would collaborate in building a new Iraqi government. That had been a key concern for many countries that felt the world body was being relegated in that process. Diplomats in France wanted the representative to report to the Council on all aspects of the formation of a new Iraqi government. The United States had originally wanted its occupation endorsed for 12 months to be extended unless the Council decided otherwise. In particular, a proposal that the UN representative report to the Council on his own work was left unchanged. The central part of the 26-paragraph draft was unchanged. If adopted, it would immediately lift the economic sanctions imposed on Iraq after it invaded Kuwait in August 1990 and would place Iraq's oil revenues into a fund to be spent at the direction of the US-led occupying forces.
The resolution defines a vital role for the Secretary General and the United Nations. It lifts sanctions and it phases out over a 6-month period the oil for food program.
But in a concession to other council members, it would phase out the UN's Humanitarian Oil for Food program in 6 months instead of 4 months, as proposed in the first version submitted on May 9. The extension is important for Russia, which has a major share of the $10.3 billion worth of contracts that have been approved under the program and for which letters of credit have been issued. In another concession to Russia, the United States agreed last week to insert language into the draft saying that Iraq's massive debts would be dealt with by multilateral systems such as the Paris Club. Remarks by some U.S. officials had encouraged fears that the United States would invalidate some of the claims by Iraq's creditors, estimated to a total of $400 billion. Moreover, the U.S. rejected letting UN nuclear inspectors back into the country, as France, Germany and Russia had said the inspectors must certify Iraq to be free of alleged weapons of mass destruction, the original excuse for the war, before UN sanctions can be finally lifted. But Negroponte said there is no role for UN weapons inspectors in Iraq, adding that the US forces were in full control of securing suspected nuclear material in Iraq.
4 U.S. Marines were killed Monday in Iraq when their CH-46 helicopter crashed in a waterway near the city of Karbala, according to U.S. defense officials. A 5th Marine was missing and feared dead after attempting to rescue them. It was not immediately clear what happened to the 5th Marine. A woman was killed and one other person injured when a bomb went off in a cafe in the heart of the Turkish capital Ankara on Tuesday. Prosecutor Ahmed Mutlu said the blast had been caused by a bomb after he inspected the site. The device went off in the toilet of the cafe immediately after a young woman entered it. The explosion caused extensive damage, shattering walls and windows of the multi-story Crocodile Cafe in one of the city's busiest intersections. This comes a month after a bomb exploded at a McDonald's restaurant in Istanbul, causing damage but no injuries. Saudi ambassador to the United States, Bandar bin Sultan, expressed his concern that the perpetrators of last week's attacks were planning for a much bigger operation based on Saudi and American intelligence information. Bandar said that 377 kilograms of explosives were found in a cache near one of the hit compounds early this month. Saudi sources said that after the explosive cache was discovered, an Al-Qaeda cell fled the country to Europe or to the United States, and another cell carried out the attacks, while a third one is believed to be free and active. Despite security fears, the U.S. consulate in Tehran reopened for normal business on Tuesday, following a one-day closure after the arrest of a gunman outside the building. Meanwhile, the investigation into last week's multiple bombings in Casablanca that killed tens of Moroccans has reached an advanced stage, with the identification of all 13 Moroccan bombers and the capture of a 14th person. Morocco said that no link had yet been established between Al-Qaeda and the bombings. Investigations point to the involvement of banned local Salafist groups, namely the Right Path and the Takfir wal-Hijra groups. On another level, the Moroccan capital witnessed a large-scale demonstration of condemnation in which Al-Adala wa Tanmiya Party and other Islamic factions took part. Meanwhile, Moroccan Interior Minister Idriss Jetto said that his country is capable of standing up to what he called terrorist attacks through necessary firmness.
The U.S. Embassy in Saudi Arabia said on Tuesday that it and other missions in the kingdom would shut on Wednesday due to fears of more attacks against unspecified targets following suicide bombings in Riyadh last week. The embassy announced in a statement that it will be closed on May the 21st and would not reopen before May the 25th. The American move was copied hours later Tuesday by the British Embassy in Riyadh, along with most of the British diplomatic missions in the country. The Anglo-American declarations are just coming ahead one day after Saudi Arabia's ambassador to Washington said that he believed the suicide bombers who struck Riyadh were planning a much bigger operation. US and Saudi officials have blamed the Riyadh bombings on Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda network. The U.S. Embassy statement followed the arrest of a Saudi who was roaming around the U.S. consulate in the eastern city of Tehran, although he did not fire any shots. And moving on to Iraq, Russia said on Tuesday that the UN resolution on Iraq must include accords on peacekeeping, as well as lifting sanctions after the U.S. overthrow of Saddam Hussein. But Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov said that he expected a deal would be reached this week in the Security Council after a shift in position by the United States. China, meanwhile, said that positive progress had been made in the UN Security Council discussions on the new U.S. resolution on lifting sanctions in Iraq, but refrained from saying whether it will back the resolution. A foreign ministry spokeswoman told a regular briefing that members of the Security Council are having consultations on the latest resolution on Iraq with some positive progress. The U.S. earlier said that it wanted a vote by the end of the week on a newly revised resolution to lift sanctions on Iraq and allow the country's oil wealth to pay for its reconstruction. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Negroponte, said that a final draft was given to the Security Council late on Monday. Morocco said on Tuesday that the young suicide bombers who killed at least 29 people in Casablanca last week were linked to international terrorism. A day after FBI agents joined the investigation into the 5 almost simultaneous blasts, Interior Minister Mustafa Sahel had said that the interrogation of the 2 would-be attackers who survived the blast had established the link. The bomb attacks on Friday night came 4 days after the killing of at least 34 people in suicide attacks against Westerners in Saudi Arabia and prompted fresh warnings from U.S. President George W. Bush that Al-Qaeda remained a threat. He said that 12 Casablanca attackers died by blowing themselves up, not 13 as initially reported, when they struck mainly Jewish and Spanish targets and a Kuwaiti-owned hotel.
And the trial of a Japanese journalist and his Jordanian translator has opened in Amman. The journalist faces charges of possession of illegal explosives and negligence that caused death and injury. The man was bringing a grenade as a souvenir from Iraq earlier this month, which exploded at the airport as it was being handled by security men. One security guard died and 3 were injured. Iman Lakour was at the court and filed this report.
I plead not guilty. I'm sorry for the tragic accident that I caused. I extend my apology to the families of the victim and the wounded and all the Jordanian people. With these words, the first public hearing of the trial of the Japanese photojournalist Hiroki Gomi and his Jordanian translator Abdessalam Al-Hilwe opened at the State Security Court in Amman. Charges against Gomi had been reduced from premeditated murder and infliction of injury to the accusations of illegal possession of an explosive and negligence resulting in death and injury.
The court has witnessed 5 witnesses, and myself, I presented some documents which contains medical reports and technical reports about the bomb. Which has been prepared and organized by these witnesses. The final charges are the possession of having a bomb and manslaughter and causing death and harm and injury without intention.
Gomi, who has lived in Jordan for the past 2 years, is married with 2 kids. He was on his way back to Japan after covering the U.S. war on Iraq when a cluster bomblet in his luggage exploded at Queen Ali Airport, killing 1 security officer, Ali Sarhan, and wounding 3 others. For over 9 hours, the state court, which consisted of 3 military judges and a civilian judge, has listened to 5 witnesses with relevance to the case. The other defendant was accused of the possession of an illegal explosive, which he unwisely kept inside his home for 2 weeks, thinking it was. And in a nice gesture from the court, the 2 were not seated at the usual defendant's section, but rather out next to their lawyer without being handcuffed, which was held by the Japanese.
I'd like to express sincere gratitude to the Jordanian people, and I believe this trial is very fair and much more speedy than we expected. And since I arrived here May 3rd, I received a lot of warm feeling from Jordanian people, even if the Gomi made big mistake and very serious consequence. But the Jordanian court and Jordanian authority expressed very sincere gratitude for us.
His Majesty King Abdullah had earlier this month received head of the Japanese Mainichi Press Group, Akiro Saito, who has offered his condolences to His Majesty over the accident. The Mainichi newspaper has distributed 1.4 million apology leaflets in Japan along with its daily issue. The Japanese Foreign Minister Yuriko Kawaguchi has also expressed her country's apology and condolences over the explosion. The State Security Court usually takes a few months to discuss such a case before ruling, but all indications refer that the case would finish within days. Another hearing session is scheduled for tomorrow, where the court is going to hear more witnesses before it announces its final verdict, scheduled to be announced within few days. Iman Lakour, Jordan Television.
Jordan has said suicide bomb attacks in the Moroccan city of Casablanca underline that the fight against terrorism is a collective responsibility to stop the killers who seek to destabilize regional states. In a telephone call to his Moroccan counterpart, Mohammed bin Isa, Foreign Minister Marwan Lemachir condemned the 5 almost simultaneous blasts which took the lives of dozens of innocent civilians. As the investigation into the bombings continued, bin Isa said separately that a foreign power was behind the attacks. He spoke after meeting in London with British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, who praised Morocco's continuing stance against terrorism. Straw said Rabat had taken strong action against Al-Qaeda terrorists. Moroccan Interior Minister Mustafa Sahel also said the young suicide bombers were linked to international terrorism. A day after FBI agents joined the investigation into the blast, the Interior Minister said the interrogation of 2 suspects who survived the blast had established the link. He said 12 Casablanca attackers died by blowing themselves up, not 13 as initially reported, when they struck mainly Jewish and Spanish targets. However, the statements appear to contradict an earlier assessment by Justice Minister Mohammed Bouzouba, who said no link had been made with any foreign organization, including Al-Qaeda.
International humanitarian aid organizations are increasingly worried about the lack of security in Iraq, which hinders their efforts to distribute desperately needed aid in the country. The president of the International Red Cross Organization, Jacob Gilbernick, asked the occupation forces to establish order and protect the basic Iraqi infrastructure, such as hospitals. Meanwhile, the International Health Organization announced that the Iraqi hospitals urgently need $20 million every month to improve the medical situation in Iraq, especially because they were exposed to wide-scale looting.
Humanitarian effects of the war in Iraq are serious and surprising. The slow progress of establishing Iraqi civilian administration is accompanied by the lack of will to deal with the effects of war on civilians. The situation of the mental institutions in Iraq is very depressing. The patients were left without food, medicine, and without medical care. The presence of the heavily armed American soldiers near the mental hospital does not seem to be helpful in calming these patients who suffer from mental problems related to the wars that Iraq went through.
A local militia force was in charge of securing the hospital. When we came here, we explained to them that the coalition forces came to relieve them.
After the doctors and medical team ran away from the hospital, the Shiite leadership in the area appointed Musa Dakhil, who says that the Americans have made things worse.
The American forces made it easier for the looters to enter the hospital because they made 4 big openings in the external wall. The looters destroyed and stole everything from the hospital. The pieces of furniture that you see here were brought from the mosques, but the looters still did not leave the hospital alone. They came back and hit the medical teams and nurses, and some patients were beaten and raped.
These fearful eyes belong to someone without a hope, someone who is trying to escape from the unknown and from the confusion of what is happening in the hospital. This tragedy is probably one of the saddest results of the war in Iraq.
Every occupation force is responsible for providing safety to the occupied civilians and protecting their basic infrastructure, especially the hospitals.
Because of the miserable medical situation in Iraq, the International Health Organization and the International Red Cross decided to meet with the Iraqi medical officials in Al-Basra. After some cases of cholera were reported, the International Health Organization announced that it is worried that the disease might spread in the south of Iraq. It appears that the water contamination and the neglect of collecting the garbage are behind the spread of cholera in Al-Basra.
Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation,